Hello and welcome to the Kroll Lens, our podcast navigating the regulatory landscape, part of our series with Kroll's experts to help you navigate the evolving regulatory environment. As an award-winning provider of compliance and regulatory consulting services to the financial services industry, Kroll helps clients develop, implement, and manage their compliance and regulatory consulting programs.
Hello and welcome to the Kroll Lens Consumer Duty series featuring technical discussions with guest subject experts, focusing on the approaching consumer duty and its impact on regulated firms. I am Matt Austen, a Senior Vice President in the UK Regulatory Consulting team, and I will be your usual host. Today we will look at the concept of proportionality and its application in terms of the consumer duty. Taking a proportionate approach to the application of new regulations is important and ensures that regulatory requirements can be tailored to a firm's size, systemic importance, complexity and risk profile. However, as a term, it often remains elusive and difficult to pin down, despite regulatory attempts to offer guidance on what this may mean in practice. To help me further explore this topic today, I'm very pleased to be joined by one of our directors, Warren Lowe. Hello, Warren, and thank you for taking the time to join us.
Hi, Matt. Good morning.
Warren is a recent addition to the team at Kroll and joins us from the FCA Asset Management Department, where he was involved in the evolution of aspects of the consumer duty, as well as providing expertise on matters such as value for money assessments. Warren also has first-line experience in public markets, including portfolio management, risk, due diligence and equity research. So, Warren, as we've said, proportionality is important when considering how new regulations may apply to any business model. Senior management of firms have to get the balance right, on one hand ensuring they respond compliantly to the regulatory policy, but on the other hand not taking a sledgehammer to the proverbial compliance nut. So I suppose with that in mind, it would be good to get your views on what the FCA means when it talks about a proportionate and reasonable application of the duty.
Okay, no, thank you for the question, Matt. I think there's probably two ways to answer that question. I think that we'll say and talk a little bit about what the FCA actually says, and then I'll give you my opinion on what I think the FCA actually means by proportionate and reasonable application of the duty. So what the FCA has said, where it applies the duty needs to apply proportionally, but what is reasonable in the circumstances. And it also goes on to say within the policy guidance that the extent of a firm's responsibilities will depend on its role and the extent of a firm's influence over retail customer outcomes. And that level of responsibility depends on the firm's actual role and influence rather than what is set out in contractual terms between firms in the chain. Now, that's a rather sort of wordy definition, which I think, we all struggle with a little bit with the duty from time to time. Essentially, what that descriptor is, I believe, is, encapsulates the concept of reasonableness, which is something that the FCA sort of quotes for not just the consumer duty, but various other pieces of legislation that it requires industry to adhere to. There is an objective test, which ultimately means that rules and guidance must be interpreted in line with the standard that could be reasonably be expected of a prudent firm. So I've just, as the FCA have done, sort of overlaid one fairly undefined in terms of practically undefined definition with another conceptual one. So what do I actually think it means? Well, one way to break this down, and I've done it, with various clients by sort of breaking down their position into three buckets. I would say, I think we're all in agreement that, you've got, the giant, houses, banks, asset managers that have, huge retail products, big distribution chains that they intersect with at various different levels. They may even directly distribute. It's very easy to understand which parts of the duty apply to those types of firms, which is effectively all three cross-cutting rules and all four outcome rules. Where it gets a little more challenging, I think, to consider what might be proportionate and reasonable is for the smaller firms. The smaller firms that may either be a manufacturer or a distributor and not both, or even a smaller firm that is perhaps a distributor for an overseas unregulated entity that only services a handful of FCA defined retail customers. That's where it gets a bit more challenging. But effectively, we think that for those firms, if I use an example at the smaller end of the scale, firms that, for example, have a handful of clients that they're a distributor only, will not, for example, need to apply in all instances the consumer support outcome because they may not have a direct contact with that consumer. What they will still have is obligations under the price and value outcome to ensure that those products and services that they're supplying meet the minimum requirements of good value for customers. So in defining where a company lies within or intersects with its distribution chain, you can sort of drop in and out different parts of the consumer duties requirements, and therefore begin to sort of build a bit of a picture from the bottom up of what might be a proportionate and reasonable application.
Lovely, thank you. I mean, that's a really good example. So I think you've introduced the concept there of the distribution chain as well, and the firm's place in it. So do you think that the overall complexities of the distribution chain impact, I guess, what the FCA might see as reasonable in terms of the application of the duty? Do you think for some firms it's a bit more clear cut and for others it perhaps isn't?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the complexity of the distribution chain is one of the key challenges in interpreting, which parts of the duty apply to different parts of the business. I think where certain clients that we've been talking to have really struggled is particularly where they have clients perhaps sort of professional or semi-professional, and certainly their regulatory permissions would indicate that they only service professional individuals or firms, where they have really struggled to make that connection between what their regulatory permissions allow them to do and actually what the consumer duties definition of their business model and intersection with retail customers actually is. And that's I think that's one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest complexities of the distribution chain.
Have you come across any clients, I guess, in your work in the last, 5, 6 months, where their role in terms of the distribution chain and therefore consumer duty application is perhaps more clear cut than others?
I think if you've got, let me take an example. If you're distributing for, say, a large US entity and you're distributing product, let's say it's an asset management product that's manufactured overseas, you're the UK and potentially the European distributor of those products, and you're professional only because you're distributing via platforms. That might be high net worth platform, for example. It may be through another third party platform provider. Your requirements there will be quite limited, and there's also a size aspect to this. So if you're a very small handful of clients, you may be perfectly reasonably entitled just to contact those clients directly to explain your firm and your position and requirements under the duty, to make that fairly rudimentary price and value assessment of what those products are, and then take action accordingly. Now, it may be that those products, and most of the time, those products and services will already meet the minimum requirements of what the duty requires. And part of the objective of the duty here is to ensure that those firms are taking and breaking down the specific requirements of the duty and assessing the price and value outcomes, ensuring that the outcomes that that product is delivering to its consumers is in line with minimum requirements.
Great, thank you. I guess I just wanted to try and build that out a little bit more for the listeners. Thank you. And you mentioned earlier on the FCA definition, which I think when it's talking about proportionality, it refers to a reasonably prudent firm, and what a reasonably prudent firm would be expected to deliver in any particular scenario. I mean, it seems to me that the term reasonably prudent is perhaps also one to explore. Do you have any perhaps thoughts on what the FCA might mean by that? As far as I know, Warren, they haven't kind of expanded on that any further, but I guess that's a clear focus of this proportionality point. Who is or what is a prudent firm? What does it look like?
I think I'll introduce another concept here, which is not an FCA concept. I'd say this is something that we've discussed with firms, and it's this sort of notion of subconscious expertise. I think, I think we have to reasonably accept, and I think the FCA does accept that, most firms are actually, generally reasonably good firms in that they don't design products and they don't price products to gouge clients. They don't necessarily focus exclusively on the top line or bottom line. They do have wider considerations. And partly that's because, treating clients well and focusing on what they need and want and ensuring that the outcomes they achieve are good will generally lead to better outcomes for the firm and its stakeholders as well. So I don't think that there's any huge disconnect between what the duty is requiring and what firms already do. Now, in terms of the definition of a prudent firm, well, a prudent firm, therefore, is one that I think that adheres to the basic principles of economics. It has to be profitable, of course, but also in order to do so, it needs to be able to provide customers exactly with what they want. And in terms of financial services, very often there's a very clear return objective. There's very clear understanding objective that clients need to understand what they're purchasing, what they're investing in, and a firm that discharges its obligations more generally in terms of giving those customers the information that it needs and giving them the outcomes that it needs, I think helps sort of define what a sort of an averagely prudent firm would be.
Yeah, I guess for me, prudence means, I guess, not taking any unnecessary risks. Having a part of not taking unnecessary risks, I guess, comes back to risks actually being foreseeable, which then plays into that FCA cross-cutting rule. And I guess it's being, the board and senior management being careful about the choices they make and thinking before acting, and perhaps following that on one step further, being able to evidence the conversations and being able to evidence that they have thought and acted in a particular way. I suppose with that in mind, what role do you think, evidence and record keeping plays in firms being able to show the regulator, look, this is how we feel we've been proportionate and reasonable in how we've approached the duty?
Yeah, I think this, and again, this talks again to this sort of notion of subconscious expertise. Most firms will do most of the requirements that are outlined within the duty. What the duty actually requires is for those processes, those procedures, those discussions at the board or the governing body level to be recorded and to be used as evidence as adherence to the duty. So, to your point, Matt, evidence is absolutely central part of this requirement. So it may well be that the outline of a prudent firm that we just described, there are many prudent or reasonably prudent firms out there, but do they all keep the appropriate records of adherence to the price and value outcome, the product and services outcome, the consumer understanding outcome separately? For example, do they have adequate training for the staff in the marketing department, for example, to be making the appropriate considerations in relation to the price and value outcome? And I think that's what this is the additional layer that the duty requires, and that is an evidence-based application of the duty, and it's absolutely central to everything that the FCA is asking for here.
Yeah, I guess what would sort of be your thoughts on how boards and senior managements and excos of firms can actually evidence that practically? In reality, what would be the sort of thing a regulator might be looking for if they want the firm to show them the steps they've taken?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think this sort of talks almost back to the first question you asked in terms of the proportionate and reasonable application, because actually there is no one size fits all, and it will depend on the size, type, and complexity of the underlying business. But if I give you a few generic examples, which I think applies to all firms, one obviously which has been is ultimately dictated by the initial milestones, the duty required for a proper plan to be put in place with the deadline that was back in October 22. So a firm needs to have a plan. It needs to have assessed where its business sits within the requirements of the duty, where its distribution activities, where its manufacturing activities, how they intersect and how they influence consumer outcomes. That's an absolute given. That plan needs to be a working plan. That didn't end in October 22. It's ongoing. Businesses change and intersections with, retail clients will change potentially over time, and that needs to be considered probably as a minimum on an annual basis. But that needs to be a very defined scoping exercise, reported into the board and potentially challenged by the board in all instances. If as a second example, you would need to, or these firms would need to sort of contact the relevant other partners, entities, distributors within their chain. So there is a requirement to, I wouldn't say open the books, but certainly to communicate with other players within the distribution chain, what the aspects of your product or service are, so that those individuals that may have similar but ultimately slightly different objectives can make an assessment on price and value, which I think is probably the best example here of what that product is, what that product is actually offering, and whether their ongoing service, be it just a distribution, be it sort of a sales and marketing one, whether their influence on consumer outcomes is sort of fair and reasonable as well.
Yeah. So I guess what underpins a lot of this is probably going to be good record keeping, isn't it, in terms of evidence? I mean, as you've said, firms are going to need to go through that exercise, going to need to work out what proportionate looks like to them, which parts of the consumer duty are in scope, which parts are out of scope. And I think we know the FCA is going to be looking for challenge at the board, but also clear decision making. And I guess that comes back to the point around record keeping. I know when we do due diligence reviews here at Kroll, generally speaking, when we look at governance, we will ask for copies of minutes and terms of reference for boards and for excos. And quite often we see that a cursory glance is perhaps paid to decisions being made in terms of what the decision was and who made it. I think bringing that back round to the proportionality point, in terms of firms being able to answer the exam question of, well, how have you ensured that you've got a proportionate and reasonable application of the duty to your business? The FCA is going to want to see the record keeping, isn't it, from boards and from the governing bodies and committees to show that discussion has been had, but not just discussion, challenge as well.
Absolutely. Yes, and that challenge is an iterative process. There's no, this is not intended, and really is very difficult to be sort of a finite box ticking exercise. This is something that needs to be ingrained within, as we said, the marketing and sales department, the product and development departments or committees. It needs to be ingrained within, the financial control element of the business as well.
Yeah. I certainly know from my time at the regulator, Warren, that if there is no evidence to support actions taken and decisions made, then it's often the case the FCA will be of the view that it didn't happen.
It is very often the case, yes.
It's not written down, it didn't happen, as somebody once said to me. Good, thank you. I mean, I think that's a really useful conversation around, what does proportionate, what does reasonable look like, and certainly this concept of prudence in what I suppose is a hypothetical firm. I sense from conversations I've had with clients that there's perhaps a bit of frustration in the industry that the FCA can't be a bit more specific on what a prudent firm looks like. But then I guess looking at it from the other side of the coin, I think we've already said proportionality means you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. So I guess the FCA is going to have to look at each firm in the round should an issue arise and make its decision then in terms of what it would have expected that firm to do.
Yeah, and I think in fairness to the to the consumer duty as a piece of legislation, I mean, we have to bear in mind this is as not a specific piece of legislation for a tiny sliver of the UK financial services industry. This is this is a holding pattern to ensure that good conduct and good outcomes are delivered by all firms that are that are authorised within the UK financial services industry, and that's a really significant undertaking in terms of number of firms, number of products, and number of services. So you can understand why that sort of lack of, specific definition is there, because it's just not possible to make a single, specific requirement relevant to all different areas of the financial services community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just bringing this on to our final point, it's been observed by many that during a recent recorded podcast with FCA Executive Director Sheldon Mills, he stated in the conversation that the FCA is seeking substantive compliance ready for day one implementation. I think that then led to a slight flurry of interest and comment and speculation around what substantive compliance actually means. I think up until that point, it hadn't been a term that had been mentioned in any of the FCA consumer duty consultations, policy statement or guidance. So I guess coming back to the point, what is it that the FCA is probably looking for there? What does it mean by substantive compliance ready for day one?
Yeah, it's a really good an important question. And I think just taking, before I answer directly, I think just taking a step back in terms of what the FCA is trying to achieve here. And I think one of the, the big challenges for industry is that the rules, and and I emphasize the word rules, this is not guidance, but the rules very often strike and read as guidance. They're sort of very detailed. They lack, as we've already identified, specific reference to behaviours, etc. And that's partly intentional, as we said, because of the breadth, the types and styles of businesses and products that the duty captures. But it's also because the FCA is effectively saying, that trying to highlight and engender a cultural shift within financial services to ensure that businesses, in the same way that they focus on profits and in the same way that they focus on various other stakeholders, they actually focus on customers and consumers in an identical and in as direct a fashion as they would for any other parts of their business. And it's not unusual, but it is somewhat different to the experience that the FCA has observed in certain sectors of financial services over the years. So having said that, what do they mean by substantive compliance? Well, I mean, essentially, this is, again, I think it's in reference to the degree to which a firm adheres to the underlying principles and goals of the duty, as opposed to simply meeting its formal requirements. So again, this comes back to this is not a box ticking exercise. This is a requirement for all people within, and departments and governing body within firms to embrace, the underlying principles of the duty, albeit those principles are, actually defined ultimately as rules. And there is, in the FCA's mind at least, a reasonable clear pathway to enforcement of those rules. I think that, the one thing we played around with when this notion of substantive compliance first hit was try and think about, well, what else could it mean? I think meaningful progress was one of the other ways that we thought, well, can we interpret it? Will meaningful progress be enough? Now, I think substantive compliance rather is much more fundamental than meaningful progress. Meaningful progress implies that, well, we've done some of it and we've done, a reasonable amount of it, but we haven't done all of it. We've still got something to do. We've perhaps not addressed we've not addressed all instances. We haven't trained all the relevant staff in their particular requirements or their department's requirements of the duty. I don't think that will be interpreted as substantive compliance, and I do think that firms that haven't addressed, the underlying principles of all of these things, at least in part, that's not to say it needs to be complete, but they need to be addressing all of these significant issues and putting in place a pathway to meeting those requirements. And I think that's the sort of the critical difference between substantive compliance and meaningful progress, is that the foundation should now be in place. There's not an expectation that every firm will be, perfectly aligned with the underlying principles of the duty, but they should have everything in place to ensure that in the foreseeable future they'll be able to deliver and implement on what the duty is requiring of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Whilst you were talking there, I quickly typed into Google, what does the mean substantive actually mean? I mean, I think we'd all like to think we know, but interestingly, it suggests that it involves matters of major or practical importance to all concerned. So I think playing there to the point you've made, it's going to be it's going to be the areas with the largest risks, isn't it, to customer outcomes? Those are the areas that the FCA will expect to see firms have identified and that any gaps have been addressed.
Yeah, absolutely correct.
Yeah, risk-based approach should be adopted. And certainly with the clients I've been working with, that's very much the approach we've taken. We've started with a gap analysis to work out, where enhancements are needed, and then we've risk rated those so we can ensure that those that carry the biggest risk are indeed dealt with by the 31st of July deadline. I think another interesting point you sort of mentioned there, firms differ in size, and therefore for me not all firms are at the same starting point, are they? If it's I suppose the best analogy I can think of is I play golf very badly, I have to point out occasionally, and we all know in golf you can start at different points, different tee-off points, depending on your ability. The read across here is not all firms start at the same point, do they, when teeing off? Some are a bit closer to the hole than others in terms of existing rule expectations. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. And again, this comes back to sort of size and complexity, the FCA has been quite clear and reasonably clear that, small firms have, have a different type of, requirement or expectations in terms of, the investment required will be, much more limited. A large firm perhaps might be expected to have, some fairly significant, management information, dashboards on its key products. I don't know, consumer complaints, perhaps, quarterly monitoring of, pricing, relative pricing, etc. There's a lot of things that big firms can do. Now, a small firm will not be required to have that kind of sort of systems infrastructure and perhaps even, sort of IT investment. But what it will still be required to do is to consider, its products and the pricing of its products. It will still need to consider, the type of, marketing materials and communications that go out externally. Now, that consideration could be as little as, a standing item in, quarterly governing body board meetings, for example. It doesn't have to be an all singing, all dancing IT management information system to provide that information. And I think that's why the term substantive compliance is so interesting, and from that perspective, because it means different things to different firms with different sizes and different budgets to able to achieve that. But what it doesn't excuse any firm from doing, be it large or small, from adhering to the minimum requirements and the principles of the underlying rules.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think for me, one of the biggest perhaps misunderstandings, if I can put it that way, that is made by some smaller firms is, we're a small firm, therefore we don't really need to do much. Small firm equals proportionately less effort. And, I don't think that's ever the case or what the regulators would expect. In fact, I'd probably offer an example where if you're a small firm and existing rules apply, so an example here will be if you're a MiFID firm and the existing rules on PROD, so that's product governance, apply, then arguably, going back to my analogy earlier, you're probably closer to the hole on that one in terms of meeting the product and service requirements, because the FCA would expect that you're already 99.9% of the way there. There are already rules you should be meeting. Those rules are broadly similar to those that are coming out under the consumer duty. Probably not much to do. So I guess at that point, if we were to get to the 31st of July and your product and service processes were still lacking, I suspect, regardless of whether you're a big or a smaller firm, you'd struggle to have any argument that you shouldn't really have been there already.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, and I just think it's in, no one's going to get this right at first blush, and I think there's a genuine understanding from the regulator on that, but there are some fairly straightforward and minimum requirements that everyone needs to adhere to, and I think that's very much captured within this statement.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And just before we wrap up, I suppose just taking your comment there, everyone's not going to get this right first time, and I think the regulator understands that. But I guess what can firms do to help themselves show that there might actually be some spillover from the implementation work in phase one, if we can call it that. What can firms do, Warren, just to show that where anything does need mopping up, that they're on top of that?
Well, again, this comes back to record keeping and evidence, Matthew. I mean, it's if those records and the requirements of the duty, if there are gaps in what they're already doing, if there are training needs for staff, perhaps there's even a little bit of investment or configuration, there's potentially some chasing up of distributors that need to be done. Now that process needs to be documented, and there needs to be a plan to work those issues out of the system over a reasonable time frame. And those plans need to be monitored, by the duty champion, for example, if one's been appointed. But certainly there needs to be responsibility at the governing body for seeing those gaps and shortfalls through.
So I guess it's important, isn't it, to have and not be scared of, I'd add, a day two implementation plan, to acknowledge that some stuff is going to slip. It shouldn't be the big stuff, but actually these are the bits and this is the plan to clear those up. It's probably the important point there.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Good stuff. Well, look, thank you, Warren, for joining me today. I think it's such an important topic, isn't it, for regulated firms where different business models, client bases and geographies mean there can never really be a one-size-fits-all solution to what is proportionate. Therefore, always requiring an element of careful judgment supported by evidence, as we've said throughout this conversation. I think in summary, I'd say the consumer duty means that the lens through which firms will be measured are probably more principles based than ever. And the definition of a proportionate and reasonable response to the duty is largely left to firms to determine. However, the new Principle 12 and supporting rules and outcomes bring into sharper focus what is expected at firms at any stage of a customer life cycle. And I guess firms should look to understand the extent of their role in the overall distribution chain, as you spoke to earlier, Warren, and their ability to materially influence the outcomes the end client may experience. I suppose if we were to put it simplistically, the more influence a firm has, the more they should be doing both now and in the future. For those listening, thank you for joining us. Please do subscribe to our series on the YouTube platform and share episodes across your professional network. Also give us a thumbs up rating, as it helps others using the platform to find and utilise our insights. If you would like to hear more from us, please look out for our regular insight articles on our website, where you can also find details of how to contact us should you wish to discuss anything you have heard here today. We will be back in the near future, so from myself and Warren, thank you and goodbye.
Kroll's regulatory advice and consulting specialists provide insight on regulatory change approaching the financial services industry, and discuss the FCA's intention to place clear accountability for compliant implementation of the consumer duty. Check out our featured insights by clicking on the link in the description.